first podcast of the Mittacast podcast hour. I haven't really officially came up with a name for the podcast, but for right now, we'll just call it Mittacast. So the inaugural podcast for our podcast, that's like a slur words there. We're going to talk about one of the most famous philosopher in the last 150 years, and that philosopher is who, Mark?
Fredrich Nietzsche.
Frederick.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Fredrich Nietzsche.
Yeah, Fredrich Nietzsche and the many, I guess, interpretations of his thinking and as well as his life. Now, me and Mark are very big Nietzsche fans. In my 20s, I read a lot of Nietzsche. One of my favorite works of Nietzsche was is Birth of Tragedy, and that's when he talks about the Greeks and essentially like the cultural history of the Greeks and Greek theater. But I also like a lot of his other stuff. What is your favorite works by Nietzsche,
Yeah,
Mark?
I would say personally my favorite that I guess works that I read from Nietzsche would be Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But then I actually think Philosophy and the Tragic Age of the Greeks is also that was the first thing he wrote. I think, or it was either published right. It was published actually around the same time as Birth of Tragedy. I think Birth of Tragedy might have come first, but they both have similar themes of exploring the Greek way of understanding the world. Where in Birth of Tragedy, it's just more holistic and about culture and philosophy, while the other one is obviously just about focusing on the key Greek philosophers that Nietzsche considered to be the pre-Platonic philosophers, although he doesn't mention Socrates in that one. But I just think that it's important in order to understand Nietzsche, you have to understand his relationships to or his relationship to Greek philosophy and just Greek culture. And he considered Greek culture to be a high culture and a great culture. And he actually was very critical of, for example, German culture. And he thought that German culture was like decadent and it was like this fallen culture, while Greek culture was this like amazing thing that there was in the past. And a lot of his like understanding of historical values comes through understanding like the greatness of Greek culture.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. I want to say Nietzsche is a big classicist. Um, when you look at Nietzsche's philosophy and also his cultural analysis, he's in the line or he's in within tradition of popular German thought at the time. You look at the 18th century, you look at the 19th century, specifically with thinkers like Johann Winckelmann and the great German idealists, most notably Schelling and Hegel, as well as Kant, because Kant writes about him or writes about Greco-Roman culture and the critique of judgment. He uses a lot of his aesthetic arguments driving from Greco-Roman art, most notably the Laocoon. And yeah, he comes from that culture, and he takes it in in his way. He takes it to another level. But like, I guess this is not going to be a structured podcast where we go on topics like, okay, this is what we're going to talk about specifically about Nietzsche versus this.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
we're just go to spitball and just talk about what's on our mind. First of all, I want to talk about the interpretations of Nietzsche. I'm on Twitter a lot. You know, I usually get on Twitter not to engage with people, but just to see what people say and what the popular culture is talking about. And there's a few Twitter pages I follow or Twitter people I follow, and they're Nietzsche guys. Like there's this one guy, his name is Left Nietzschean, and he's like I guess he's a Nietzsche scholar. This is not a diss to him if he ever watches this or listens to this podcast. But he went to school and got a PhD in Nietzschean philosophy. Honestly, I didn't know you could do that. But his whole thing about Nietzsche is that like you can read Nietzsche as like a leftist thinker, which to me is just weird, because if you read Nietzsche at all, you don't even have to read the guy closely. You can tell that the guy is anti-democratic and like the leftist notion of what democracy is, and he attacks socialists. off the top of my head, I'm thinking of Gianluigi Amoro's the first argument he makes. He talks about how he hates like this current movement of like libertarianism, like the British brand of it, and also the socialists. So, like I said, seeing like all these different political Twitters just trying to politicize Nietzsche is weird to me. Because how the way I look at Nietzsche, I know this was kind of like a popular dot for a little bit. Um, People didn't look at Nietzsche as a philosopher. I always they looked at him as a cultural critic and kind of like a polemist. And I see him like that more so than like, you know, a political philosopher in anything, you know. A lot of his writings is like criticism, like, textual criticism. Like you read it Beyond Good and Evil, he's really, critiquing Western, the Western canon. I mean, the philosophical canon goes within that, but he's really making an overall argument of how to interpret text and why this or the traditional way of interpreting like text within the notion of good and evil or binaries is the wrong way. Um, but yeah, I just think it's weird how people try to politicize Nietzsche because very few of his writings are political, in my opinion. Or I mean, I don't even think it's my opinion. I think that's
Yeah.
true. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, no, I agree that there isn't really much of a focus on politics in his works, and he does focus on very general and like grand cultural narratives. And in some ways, you can see how he could influence like people like Oswald Spengler, especially with The Birth of Tragedy, where he describes why he thinks Greece ended up kind of falling as a culture, and he sees that as being like the influence from Socrates. But even before Socrates, one of the other things that he does with his cultural analysis is he creates like parallels between his culture and then the cultures of the past, which is another kind of Spenglerian thing. And just to give a bit more context, Oswald Spengler was this German author who wrote the this series of like I guess 2 volumes that he's well known for called The Decline of the West, where he creates a whole uh, like he has a morphology where he studies the forms of different cultures in the past and in the present, and he sees them as being these organisms that have a youth stage and then eventually they get older and then they die. And Nietzsche does a similar thing before Spengler, and he compares, for example, Anaximander in the ancient Greek world to Schopenhauer, and he compares himself, or he seems to compare himself to Heraclitus from the Greek world. And Anaximander, all we have from him is this one fragment that was left over. But the fragment describes this thing in Greek. The word is apeiron, which in English translates to like boundlessness. Like a is like a negative prefix, and then like it's a negation, and then peiron is like border or a bound. So it's a lack of borders. It's just complete infinity. And Anaximander describes the finite world of becoming as exiting from this pure infinity. And the things that appear in our world, they steal from this infinite source. And because of that, Anaximander uses the word justice to say that there is a rule of justice that says that these things, these finite things, have to be destroyed as punishment for stealing from this like infinite primordial source. And it's very similar, or Nietzsche points out that it's very similar to Schopenhauer's metaphysics, where you also have this idea that everything is finite and everything is being punished for the sin of existence, and that existence is a sin, and that existence is wrong, and that really there's like pure, uh, undifferentiated infinity is like pure being. And that's what Nietzsche's against. And he sees himself as being more in the sense of what Nietzsche's interpretation of Heraclitus is, where Heraclitus is saying that what's really real is the change. It's not this like pure realm of being. And I actually think that in Nietzsche, he has this idea of eternal return. And I actually think that eternal return is in some ways the opposite of what Anaximander referred to with apeiron. Because in apeiron, you have the infinite, like non existence of things. And then there's the finite world of things. And the finite world of things, all those things have a rule that they have to leave and return back to a pairon, and return in the sense of being destroyed. Now, if you take that and flip it upside down, then you actually say that things have to return out of non-existence and back into the world of becoming. And that actually is what the eternal return is all about. It's all about saying that, okay, you've got these beings that actually have to keep returning to existence rather than returning into non-existence, which is what a pairon is about. And I think that that's one of the reasons why, when there's all these debates over whether Nietzsche was a metaphysician or not, I would side more on the side of him having a metaphysics, because just having that kind of conception, like when you invert a metaphysical idea, you still have a metaphysical idea, even if it's like turned around on its head. So yeah, that's my
So,
thought.
like, right quick, when you say metaphysics, do you mean like metaphysics in a philosophical term or metaphysics in general?
I guess I mean it in a philosophical term. So I like the way Heidegger defines metaphysics, where he says that metaphysics is the study of the being of beings.
Hmm.
So insofar as like all beings have to return, or all beings are will to power, I think when Nietzsche says things like that, those are metaphysical statements, because when you're trying to understand like what beings are in their essence, and you say it's will to power, and you say that it's eternal return, I think that's metaphysics.
Okay, yeah, because like to me, how the way I look at metaphysics is like cultural metaphysics. Like I think metaphysics are embedded within the culture. So you have like the metaphysics of like Greek culture, and Spengler talks about this too when he says, essentially the metaphysics of Greek culture is the body or like magnitude. So when you look at all cultural products of that culture, whether it be literature, you know, I guess traditional art like sculpture and painting, it all reference that metaphysical ideal. So because like I'll read something like, for example, I think in the same argument, someone like William Burroughs is a metaphysician because he gives you a metaphysics of postmodern society, right? A society post the Second World War and the what's it called, the American boomer era, American I forgot the right word you call it, but that society, the boomer society, the baby boomer society. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's like a matter of interpretation because, like I said, the more and more I read Nietzsche, the more and more I see him as like a really good, cultural critic, and he takes a lot of like what he's gotten from, classical theology, and he turns it into a way to interpret, cultural phenomenon. Philosophy is in him. There's philosophical concept that's in Nietzsche's writing, but I'm trying to think here. Like when I think of philosophy, like true philosophy, I think of Immanuel Kant. Like, Kant is arguing a perspective. He's trying to develop a system. Um, I don't know. Maybe that's a poor argument that I'm making here.
Well, yeah, I would say that I agree completely that Nietzsche's like an anti-systematic thinker, but I think, and I also agree with you that he is in a lot of ways fundamentally a cultural critic, but I think first and foremost he is a philosopher, and I think that his philosophy, it leads him to becoming a cultural critic, because he understands that everything that he sees around him is like an expression of a kind of health. Because if everything is will to power, then it becomes, okay, what is actually, is this will to power active? Is it reactive? Is it healthy? Is it sick? And then that's why cultural criticism becomes fundamental. And it's not like Platonism or Kantianism, where you're like talking about like the eternal, like whatever truth outside of culture, the like acultural essence of things or whatever. Nietzsche is actually, he actually does care about culture, but that's because he still has this ultimate essence of things, but the ultimate essence of things is defined by these cultural values. So culture like comes to the forefront, I guess, in
Well,
his.
that's why I say that and use Kant as because Kant doesn't really talk about culture. Kant's really more of a traditional philosopher when he's making philosophical arguments and he's arguing against other philosophers on whether or not, like, why my philosophical system works more. I mean, the only time he really talks about culture isn't critique of judgment. And even then, he's not looking at culture in the context of like, birth of tragedy. When Nietzsche says, look at this culture, like look at, barring or your term, or which you said earlier, the health of Greek, classical Greek
Yeah.
culture, right, versus like the decadence of um, the Prussian culture. Well,
Yeah, and
yeah,
he even talks about
German.
like
Go ahead.
oh yeah, he even talks about like really specific things, like the fact that they drink loads of beer. So even just some aspect of that, or he sees Wagner as at the beginning he saw Wagner as being great, but then he saw Wagner as becoming way too Germanic, and he actually was very strongly against German nationalism. If you see what he wrote in his own notes and in his final text Ecce Homo, which is ironic given what later happened with certain people who appropriated Nietzsche and used it to justify like German nationalism, which was
Mhm.
actually something Nietzsche was completely against.
Yeah, yeah, and that's another thing. And it goes back to what I was talking about with politics. Um, Nietzsche is like the ultimate contrarian. He doesn't really have a position. I mean, people will say he's conservative because he goes back to the Greeks, but when you look at Greek culture, or how the way he talks about Greek culture, is not conservative in the way how we see conservative in like the Enlightenment, French Revolution, since we have the left and the right. Greek culture is a completely different cultural spirit than our culture. Like he looks at Greek culture as a way a historian will look at Greek culture versus how a modern or a fascist like a Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini would look at Greek culture.
Yeah, I think that's basically completely accurate. And I wanted to talk about another aspect of Nietzsche, which is that after he died, there became all these debates over what his actual positions were. And one of the things that harmed Nietzsche's reputation was that his sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, that she uh, edited and even forged a lot of works that she claimed were by him. I think there was like 30 different things that she faked to make Nietzsche seem more anti-Semitic or as if he was justifying some kind of what ended up becoming Nazism. And Nietzsche's sister, was actually friends with Adolf Hitler himself, and the like Nietzsche archive, which she ran, received support from the Nazi Party and allowed her to keep corrupting his stuff. And one of Nietzsche's closest friends, Franz Overbeck, who Nietzsche writes a lot about in his journals as really one of his greatest friends, actually refused to cooperate with her when she was setting up the Nietzsche archive because he told her that she's just completely misinterpreting what Nietzsche wrote. And if you can hear it from Nietzsche himself in one of his uh, texts, I forgot where it was, he wrote that one of the greatest arguments against affirming eternal return is that he would have to live his life again with his mother and sister. And he really didn't like his sister. And he also says something very interesting, which is that he says his sister and his mother, he considered them to be completely German, while him and his father he considered to be completely Polish. And his father, Nietzsche didn't really know his father that well. His father died, I think, when Nietzsche was 7, but he felt such a close connection to him that even once Nietzsche never was rich, but at some point he was able to make a bit more money, and he spent the money on giving his like father's grave a nicer headstone. And he actually put uh I believe it was like love or I don't remember exactly what the quote was, but it was a quote from the Bible because his father was a pastor. And that goes against a lot of the ways people think of Nietzsche, where they think of him as just, oh, he hated Christians or something. But that's actually something he did once he was able to make a bit of money.
Yeah, I think like Nietzsche or people's interpretation of Nietzsche and his views of Christianity is mixed. Or in the perspective of Nietzsche, is mixed because Nietzsche talks good about Jesus. You read Thus Zarathustra, he's saying Jesus is Ubermensch. He was the only Ubermensch in the Christian tradition. Then Paul comes after him and perverts his messages. I think Nietzsche overall is trying to do is he's trying to borrowing from Heidegger here, he's trying to make a way for a new God for Western culture. He feels that Western society, Western European society, is at a decadent period, and like the transcendentals that inform a healthy culture no longer exists in Greek culture, or not Greek culture, sorry, Europe, Western European culture. And like I said, he's trying to open that back up, and the way he tries to open that up is through critique. Basically, being real with the Europeans, like we don't have a culture anymore. The culture that we do have is like this decadent cosmopolitanism where we worship politics and money, and not true products of culture like high art, literature, um, the God, so on and so forth. So yeah, I don't think Nietzsche was anti-Christian in the sense that like he hated Christianity as I guess like the thing in itself. I think what he hated about Christianity is his values. I think he liked the ideal of Jesus as a kind of prophet of new laws or a new way of life, but ultimately, like I said, I think he didn't like what came after Jesus and what Jesus' disciples did to his teachings.
Yeah, and actually speaking of that, the man I mentioned earlier, Franz Oberbeck, who refused to cooperate with Nietzsche's sister in setting up an archive of Nietzsche's works, he was one of Nietzsche's closest friends, and he was actually a Protestant theologian. So that should say something, that one of Nietzsche's actual best friends was a very committed Christian. And Nietzsche even wrote somewhere, he acknowledged that a lot of Christians actually liked his work, and that he did not actually see himself as someone who just hated Christianity. And he actually says that anything he attacks, he only attacks because he thinks it is high enough that it is worth him attacking it. And he is not willing to put his name next to anything that is truly like so terrible and disgusting. He would not put his name next to it, whether to defend it or to attack it.
Yeah, yeah,
So
I
what he's
agree.
implying there is that if he is to attack something, he sees it as having a high value. Otherwise, he won't even like mention it at all.
No, I agree. Yeah, absolutely. Like, I don't know. I think Nietzsche's writing so elusive that it's open for any type of interpretation. Like, you go to the '60s with like the French left with Michel Foucault. I mean, I'm trying to make this as applied as possible. I'll just say this: Foucault just perverts Nietzsche's writing. I don't like Foucault at all. But
I
you look,
actually don't know what Foucault says about Nietzsche. I know like Deleuze's view on Nietzsche, I'm somewhat favorable towards a lot of. I think Deleuze's view is pretty interesting, but I don't actually know what Foucault says.
I mean, from what I read of Foucault, he doesn't explicitly mention Nietzsche. Like, okay, Nietzsche said this. What he does is he takes Nietzsche's genealogical method and he applies it to like all Western history. And with that, he just says that essentially there's no essence of Western history, or the essence of Western history is like repression. And because this repression is based off of power and not inherent, like I guess like we were talking about earlier with the transcendentals, like God, faith and stuff like that, um, is essentially nothingness. It's essentially nothingness and completely arbitrary. And he does this through a series of works. Like he writes. Then this is the one that really turned me off of Foucault, which is the Theory of Sexuality, Volume One, when he's making an argument about the history of Western sexuality, and where all it is just power relations, and ultimately there's really no argument against underage relations with children, or pre-pubescent children, not pre-pubescent, teenage children. I'm trying to find the right word to use for that. Yeah, but teenage children, like there shouldn't be
It's really
consent.
terrible. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Oh,
disgusting work, and I feel like anybody who really, supports that guy is like a piece of shit.
yeah.
Um, but
That's why I'm kind of glad that I've actually never read him, and I don't really have that much of an interest in reading him. There's just so much stuff that's much more worthwhile out there, you know.
yeah, I mean, honestly, I ain't trying to make this like a Foucault thing, a little Foucault side project. But like Foucault, like he's not even a philosopher. He's like a critic, like a cultural critic,
Yeah.
like Nietzsche, but like a bad version. Because I think or from when I read him, or when I read him, it's like he has an agenda. Nietzsche doesn't have an agenda. He's just like trying to tell you the truth of things. And while he's telling you the truth, he's trying to give you like a prescription to like save like humanity from like this truth, right? This guy just says no, there's no truth, and I should have sex with boys. Like it's
It's
just completely degenerate, and it's terrible. He doesn't know anything about history, like true historical analysis, or Western culture, other than breaking it down for his corrupt agenda. But whatever. I'm not going to talk about him the whole podcast. But yeah. Anyways, yeah. There's
I was
different.
gonna
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna mention when you mentioned the Foucault, I'm gonna get off of Foucault, but you did mention that Foucault sees it as like this history of repression. And I think that that kind of connects to psychoanalysis, and it's undeniable that psychoanalysis is something that was incredibly influenced by Nietzsche. Actually, Freud hid all the Nietzsche books he had because he said that if people knew that he had read all of Nietzsche, they would just realize that he copied all of his ideas from Nietzsche. And sometimes people would even give Freud Nietzsche books as gifts as a way to like play a joke on him because he would pretend that he had never read Nietzsche, but actually he hadn't. I think it's kind of just like an open secret that
Yeah,
Nietzsche was.
yeah. I remember when I read Freud for the first time, I was just like, dude, this reads a lot like Nietzsche. Like, did he like read Nietzsche? And I remember researching, and I wasn't able to find a conclusive answer. But the fact that you said that, I really appreciate it because, like I said, I always knew that he read Nietzsche because it's almost like word for word the same thing. I mean, the archetypes are different. Instead of like, I mean, yeah, I mean, they're kind of similar because they're still using Greek archetypes or Greek, symbols. Instead of using like Dionysus and Apollo, he uses to play Oedipus Rex, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, I definitely see the influence on Freud and Nietzsche, and just you have that Deleuze's interpretation of Nietzsche is probably more closer to Nietzsche, but honestly is a very because what Deleuze focuses a lot more on Nietzsche's writings is like the metaphysical aspect when you talk about the eternal return. He's really big on the eternal return and like what that fully entails when it comes to representation. Like you read Nietzsche in philosophy, he talks about how essentially the true nature of reality is like the Dionysian, whirlpool of like, infinite infinite like force or the will to power, right? And how different like forces from this whirlpool act off each other, and from this clash of forces you have interpretation versus because at this time he's really or a lot of people in the French academia are against Hegel, where Hegel would say that the nature of reality is like dialectical, right? You have forces where, a subject is reacting to a force. And from that reaction, he legislate whatever this force, or this phenomenon reacted to him, or yeah, reacted to him is. And yeah, Deleuze says no, that's not it. Nietzsche had it right. Nietzsche is like one of the great metaphysicists because he says the true nature of reality is just forces acting on each other indefinitely. Then it's our task as a individual to interpret these forces or to have a free interpretation of forces than a binary interpretation of like you know good versus evil, subject object, so on and so forth.
Yeah, one of the really interesting things in Deleuze's analysis of how Nietzsche sees these forces is he he says that even when we interpret these forces, the interpretation will always be more reactive than the forces themselves. And Deleuze actually associates consciousness with reactivity, while what's the body with activity. And actually, Nietzsche does that as well. So it's not some new
Yeah,
Deleuzian
like I
spin on
said,
it.
I think like Deleuze is because he says a lot of this in Will to Power too. Like the section Will to Power, Eternal Return, he talks a lot about forces and like how you have active and reactive forces. Like I said, I think Deleuze read Nietzsche very closely, and I think one of or the top influences of Deleuze's style, which would be Spinoza, which is kind of like a proto Nietzsche.
Yeah,
Leibniz.
and Spinoza does say that we know a lot more about what the mind can do, and we know almost nothing about what the body can do.
Yeah, exactly. And also his notion of affects, right? And how affects are like these senses that the body perceives and interprets versus like, things that come from us. Like I guess it's been a while since I read Rene Descartes, but Descartes would probably say, well, everything of reality is extension of mind.
But what I find very interesting in Deleuze is that when it goes to the most extreme level, what he actually basically, like, the insight from him is that all knowledge is inherently reactive, and actual true unconscious, like all these whatever flows and all those things Deleuze uses, like all these machines and flows, like those terms he uses to describe on all these unconscious processes, that though that's actually where the real activity is. And it's kind of, he doesn't use these terms of like the map and the territory, and the map is not the territory, but basically if Deleuze were to use those terms, he would say that the map is always reactive while the territory that's being mapped by the map is active. So when we do science, we look at animals or something, we analyze an animal and we only analyze it as a reactive being, but underneath like our scientific understanding of an animal, there's this actual like active thing there that is so much more incredible and active and life affirming than anything we can perceive of it when we do this analysis on it. And the thing that Deleuze is also in agreement on with Nietzsche is that it's not like there's no cognition, like there's no way out for us out of the reactive trap, because actually there is something called art, or there's like what Nietzsche sees as like Greek tragedy, where you can actually have, you can glimpse at things in their most, I guess, active sense. Like instead of trying to scientifically like take apart an animal, we can understand like the animal as a force of nature or something, the way that the ancient Greeks did. And that's why in a lot of ways Nietzsche would see the Greeks as having such a high culture, is because they just perceived these immense forces of nature within everything in a
Yeah,
way that's, yeah.
exactly. The gods are nature. You look at the Iliad. All the gods are essentially projecting the fight onto the Greek in Trojan fighters. Athena go not Athena. Well, Athena in I'm trying to remember her name. I don't want to use her Roman name, but Aphrodite. There you go. Aphrodite are interrupting the fight between I can't remember. I think it was Miletus and in Paris. Um, everything is orchestrated by the gods, and the gods being a metaphor for the forces of reality. Um, I think that's another reason, like you said, Nietzsche liked the Greeks so much because they were so real about the things about reality. Like, everything was embedded in the world. Nothing was transcending above it. Like you look at Christianity and Judaism, there is a strict separation between God and his people, his elk. But with the Greeks, the gods live with the Greeks. They live with the people, and they directly influence the lives of the people that they reign over.
Yeah, I also, so yeah, I guess that's back to the Greek stuff. I was also thinking about the way in which Nietzsche is a perfect like ending to modern philosophy, because if we see modern philosophy as beginning with Descartes, it's actually interesting that in Descartes he has the demon that can trick him, like the evil genius
Yeah,
entity that can say like, okay, 2 + 2 = 3, you like everything is a lie, and can trick him in every single way. And then Descartes says, well, I still know I'm being tricked, so I think therefore I am. But then Nietzsche also has the demon, and with Nietzsche's demon, he says, imagine like you're lying in bed and the demon visits you, and the demon tells you that you have to relive your life over and over again, and the moonlight coming through the window and the spider on the like windowsill or whatever, that they will also return forever again and again. And then Nietzsche tells this demon that you're actually a god. And actually, there's something similar uh, to that with Descartes' one as well, because in Descartes, the demon has like this godlike power. So I guess it just feels interesting to me that there's this kind of trend in the philosophy of modernity from Descartes to Nietzsche of putting a demon in the place of God. And I don't know if it's kind of a response to the previous Christian philosophy and theology that had been going on up until that point, where you have all these questions of what can God do, what can God not do, and then it turns into, okay, what if this entity is actually not God? What if it's not on our side or something? And that's kind of what Descartes has, because you do have all these arguments about, can God make like a triangle with 4 sides or something? And I think Aquinas would say no or something. But then uh, it does cause like skepticism, and that's I think why Descartes brings in this demon. And
what?
then
Go ahead.
yeah, yeah, and I was just gonna say, and then Nietzsche once again brings in a demon, and for Nietzsche, the demon is also is also a god, and he like embraces what the demon has to offer, like the new proclamation about the existence of things.
Well, maybe the demon, and this is just me spitballing here. Maybe the demon is active, like the active force that Nietzsche talks about with the eternal rules of power, where you're trying to, let's just say, the name on something that's preventing you from interpreting things for how the way you want to interpret it. Because a lot of these philosophies is based off of like, personal interpretation. This is my view of reality, and so be it. Because like a God will stop that. A God would stop your sovereignty, like the God of Christianity. I mean, you can't do everything within the purview of the Christian God. You can't cheat on your you can't sleep with your friend's wife. You can't have same sex relationships. Like all these things that limit the capabilities of the individual. So it could be that. I know.
Well,
Go
I
ahead.
think that might be part of it, but I'm also skeptical that what Nietzsche was trying to do was he was trying to do a certain type of liberation, because in a lot of places he says that like freedom is actually can be another word for tyranny, and he's very skeptical of these beliefs that, oh, we're becoming more free as a society because of the French Revolution or something. He obviously does still take like a lot of values from the French Revolution, but I don't think that his end goal is some kind of like political emancipation or even uh, that kind of freedom, because I think even that kind of freedom still can enslave people, and that's something that makes sense, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, I feel like that's a problem with modern society. Like, I'm really trying not to be cliche here, but it's like we live in a matrix, right? Like, I see people on Twitter argue about political philosophy and politics, and it's just like, none of this stuff matters. We have no control over this stuff ultimately. And what we really should do is refine our will, refine the things that strengthen us individually and help us in like our immediate life, right? Like I said, another cliche,
Yeah.
reading, going out on hikes, uh, spending more time with your family, um, disciplining yourself from vices that you don't need to consume or participate in, stuff like that. Because all
Well,
politics. Go ahead.
I was going to say actually another interesting thing with the, I think, psychoanalysis and Nietzsche is that the first ever woman to become a psychoanalyst, she was a close friend of Freud's. Her name was Lou Andres Salome, and she was German and Russian and French, I think. And she actually was very close with Nietzsche. They were very close friends. She even claimed that Nietzsche proposed to her twice, although uh, there's other sources that say that she could have made that up, maybe. But she wrote this book, which was kind of a psychoanalytical, uh, I guess, a psychoanalysis of Nietzsche. And in her book, she basically splits Nietzsche into having two phases. The first one is his kind of positivist, logical phase where he criticizes culture, he criticizes religion, and he does this more like logical explanation of what's wrong with these different systems. And then she sees in his second phase, with Thus Spoke Zarathustra and other writings, she actually refers to it as being mystical. And she says that what happens is that Nietzsche like completely embraces the Dionysian, and he creates this kind of dance where he brings like man, world, and God into like one thing, and it's just this uh, kind of incredible thing. And it's interesting that you have someone like Rudolf Steiner who had met Nietzsche once, although I don't think they really talked. But Rudolf Steiner was a friend of Nietzsche's sister, and Rudolf Steiner, in his text on Nietzsche, he actually attacks her, Lou Andres Salome. He attacks her and says that actually Nietzsche did not have mysticism in his work. And I don't know. I find that kind of
Yeah,
strange in some ways.
you said Rudolf Steiner said that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's probably saying that because he's a mystic and he has his own brand of mysticism that doesn't subscribe to what Nietzsche is doing. So, of
Well, I
course,
think
he's
it's because his mysticism is very scientific, and Nietzsche is actually, if I remember correctly, I think it's in Genealogy of Morals. He also has a criticism of modern science, and he sees science as being reactive in a lot of ways, and that would include spiritual science, which is what Rudolf Steiner, the way that Nietzsche inverts the like Platonic tradition, and I guess also more so Aristotelian in some ways, tradition that Nietzsche is opposed to, is that in Aristotle also writes about masters and slaves, and Aristotle identifies masters with the soul and slaves with the body. and he sees masters as being active and slaves as being passive, which Nietzsche agrees with. But for Nietzsche, it's the other way around. He would say the soul is part of the slave, and then the body belongs to the master. And he even says, Nietzsche says that one of the benefits, I guess, of slave morality was that it actually made the men of the West have deeper souls.
Mm,
So he's actually very much interested in connecting slave morality to the soul and master morality to the body, which, from a Greek perspective, would seem completely idiotic, or from not a Greek, from an Aristotelian perspective, because there's different stages of Greek
mm.
perspectives. Uh, and especially when Nietzsche says something like your body has more wisdom in it than all of your philosophies, that would, if Plato heard that, Plato would just go completely insane if he heard that the body had more wisdom than
Yeah.
philosophy and the soul does. So it's actually just, I think people don't appreciate enough how radical of a change what you have with Nietzsche is from what you had for all this like almost 2000-year history. Uh,
No, yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right.
and
Nietzsche
now a
was,
lot of people take it for granted. Now everybody just assumes that it's always been like this, that yeah, the body, whatever, we're all about our bodies and body positivity, or I don't know, just all sorts of people are always talking about bodies now. Like they refer to humans as bodies, like all sorts of stuff. But that would have been very strange before Nietzsche.
yeah, yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I agree with you with that sentiment. But yeah, I think this is it. You think we're good?
Yeah, because this is like a hour-long podcast, right?
Yeah, I think we're good, man. So we'll
Okay.
conclude this edition of the
Thank you for
podcast.
having me. Yeah.
No problem. And hopefully this will be the first of many. Thank you for listening and have a good night.